Good evening and welcome to this IMPAKT online event named Cyborg Futures with Peter-Paul Verbeek. My name is Jeroen Witjes. I'll be one of your hosts tonight together with online event named Cyborg Futures. Together with my colleague here next to me named
Michelle. Welcome.
Exactly.
We have always been cyborgs. This is a starting point for tonight because we have as a special guest Peter-Paul Verbeek. He's distinguished professor of philosophy of technology at the University of Twente. His research deals exactly with the philosophy of the relationship between humans and technology. He's also part of many commissions, including the UNESCO Commission for Ethics of Science and Technology, and is currently working on a 10-year research project on the ethics of socially disruptive technology. A very suggestive title. Welcome, Peter-Paul Verbeek. We can't wait to ask you all our questions. Hello.
Thank you.
And all the questions that you might have during the presentation, please send them to questions@impact.nl or type them in the YouTube chat. We are very much looking forward. But first.
First we'll quickly show, we quickly want to show the project that this event is based around, which is our web project Cyborg Futures, which you can access by going to, well, as you see on the screen, cyborg.impact.nl. This project contains several artworks from a couple of artists based in the Netherlands and Germany, some key questions interviews with experts, artists, and other designers and academics, and then also the now 4 lectures, including lectures by famed cyborg artists Stellark, who's a pioneer in the field of cyborg artistry and research, and Neil Harbison, the first legally avowed or legally recognized cyborg artist and cyborg person, really. We had earlier events with Stellark and Neil Harbison, and tonight we'll watch Peter-Paul Verbeek, and after the event the lecture can also be rewatched on this page you see here. So please visit cyborg.impact.nl after this event. So without further ado, we would like to move towards the Cyborg Futures presentation by Peter-Paul Verbeek. And once again, I would like to remind you, if you have any questions for Peter-Paul during or after the presentation, please send them to questions@impact.nl or type them in the chat below. I wish you a lot of fun and an educational period with the presentation, and we'll see you afterwards again.
We have come to live in a digital society. People have even come to call our society Society 5.0, the 5th type of society after the 4th Industrial Revolution. I will say more about that later in this talk. The main question that I would like to address with you is, what can the notion of a cyborg still mean in this 5th society, in this digital world, which has also become an intercultural world, a global world, where technologies do not only have a local impact, but have an impact all over the globe. And I will use the notion of the hand as a guiding notion through my talk, which I titled "On the Other Hand, an Inclusive Ethics for Cyborgs." In the first part of my talk, I will try to explain how we have become new cyborgs, how we have in fact always been cyborgs, but how the digital revolution, well, reorganizes the meaningfulness of the notion of the cyborg in the first place. First hand and second hand is the title of that first part of my talk. The second part of my talk will be called All Hands on Deck. Are all hands on deck? How can we think about the notion of the human as an element of the cyborg? What human is in a cyborg? What counts as human in the ideas of cyborgs in the digital world? And then third, I will speak about ethics, governance, how to deal with cyborg technologies in a responsible way, how to take the future in our own hands as a third way to toy with the notion of the hand, where you see here 2 different types of hands. Of course, So let's first go to the new cyborg that we are in fact making of ourselves. It has almost become a commonplace within philosophy of technology to say that we have in fact always been cyborgs. Stellar's work very beautifully shows that in this famous performance art that he made about the third hand. Again, a hand, which is an alienating a piece of art at first sight. A third hand looks totally unhuman. When you think, is this indeed going to be the future? Since it's even called evolution. But at the same time, there is this second technology playing a role that we hardly still notice as a technology, which is the technology of writing. He's writing the word evolution. And writing, of course, is also a technology and quite a recent invention if you look back in the history of humankind. Stellar's work shows that we have in fact always been cyborgs, and it really depends on, well, the age that you take as a point of reference, how alienating you experience new technologies that play a role in your life. The hands, therefore, have also always played quite a big role in philosophical anthropology, the field within philosophy that tries to understand with which concepts you can analyze what it means to be human. So here, the presentation of the new iPhone model in 2017 nicely toys with these two entities, the hand X and the iPhone. And that quite nicely ties into a discussion within philosophical anthropology that does exactly the same thing. Leroy-Gourhan, a famous French anthropologist, interestingly has analyzed how, in fact, the hands should be seen as the key to understanding what has made us human. From the theory that what sets us apart from other animals is the fact that we started to walk on two legs rather than on four, which gave us actually two arms and two hands ultimately. And in the course of evolution, we only had an advantage over other species or other, varieties of our own species, if we could add cognitive capacities to that. If you, for instance, had memory, so that you could memorize how you could use an object. Using an object is the key thing that you can do if you have hands. An animal has to operate objects with its mouth, but we can use our hands. So memory helps, language helps to explain to other humans how they can use tools, forms of creativity, so that you can design new technologies. So the hands, in fact, were at the origin of what has made us human. And it has also resulted in some kind of a niche in our environment in which we could develop as humans. Also meaning that we have basically evolved in interaction with technologies, in close interaction with technologies, meaning that we have become technological by nature. Technology is our nature. We're not an animal with something extra, with language or with reason or something. We're basically an animal in which something is missing, which we need to compensate for with technology. It's quite an influential approach within the philosophy of technology, so to say. Artificiality is our nature. That also means that we have to get towards an alternative approach to technology than the approach that we humans are the subjects and technologies are the objects. And the question is, for instance, for ethics, how we can be some kind of a boundary guard between the two, how we can make sure that not too much technology enters the world of the humans. In order to see technology as the human condition, it's important to see technology as a medium. Like the water is a medium for the fish to swim in, which fish hardly notice, but it enables them to move in specific ways, to communicate in specific ways, to eat in specific ways. Technology is our medium, and technology is a medium connecting us to the world. It's not an object opposed to a subject, but it's actually the channel, the connection between the subject and the object, between human beings and the world in which they live, helping to organize how we behave, how we perceive the world, how we interpret the world, how we organize our social environment. Technologies are the medium that enables us to be humans. Technology is the condition of humankind, you could say. And this is where the fourth industrial revolution comes in, shaping this new kind of cyborg. If we have always been cyborg, then it means that new technologies make us new cyborgs. That this notion of the cyborg is not one stable notion, but it's in continuous flux. And so the notion of the fourth revolution basically claims that after the first revolution of mechanization and water power, and the second revolution of the assembly line, mass production, the third revolution of automation, we are now living in the fourth industrial revolution. an age of cyber-physical systems, as people say, meaning basically that information technology becomes physical, becomes material. And the internet becomes an internet of things. Artificial intelligence is embodied in the body of a robot, which means that our everyday life world becomes flooded with technologies. Technologies become kind of a biotope in which we live. Which also means that the older ideas of human technology relations as people using technologies with their hands, like David Bowie is doing here behind the first Apple Macintosh, that notion of use has become a bit obsolete. It's not a subject using an object where the subject has the goals and the objects give the means. No, technologies are actually merging with our environment. Smart cities, smart hospitals, smart homes. Sensor networks that detect us, that see how we behave, where we are, and that actually also influence our behavior. We do not use these technologies, they use us as much as we use them. They also do not only merge with our environment, but also with our bodies. In that sense, the notion of the cyborg has also taken a new direction with the implantation of electrodes in the brain, where Parkinson's patients, people with specific psychiatric disorders, can tweak their brain functioning in radically new ways, which is philosophically a dazzling possibility. If the brain is the organ that gives us freedom, then suddenly by being able to tweak the functioning of the brain, we have developed a freedom towards freedom, some kind of a meta freedom, so to say, which is quite a fundamental change in these digital times in the human condition, you could say. Well, you can go on for a long time with all these new human technology configurations that have emerged in these digital times. And we have augmentation, where the human-world relation gets this second layer, where there's kind of a bifurcated relation with the world. We see the world through glass, and at the same time also we see information about the world. Then interaction, real interaction with a robot, a robotic system that enables us to interact with it by showing emotions, also by reading our emotions. Cooperation, an artificially intelligent system, a system that is able to, for instance, look at a patient record and help the doctor. The doctor gets an account of the patient, the AI system gets an account of the patient, and the AI system also needs to understand to what extent the doctor understands it. A cooperation between humans and technologies that has, we have never seen before. Artificial agency has become quite common, being present at a distance. In these times of the virus, we're doing this all the time, where, of course, we have this kind of second body, be it only a screen, be it a drone, whatever, that we can operate to be somewhere else and to perceive somewhere else, sometimes even to act somewhere else. But we have to learn to live with that second body. Ultimately, obviously leading to the fear of replacement of the human being, where the notion of the cyborg stops being meaningful, because then there is no human element anymore, then technologies have taken over. An old fear that has typically always taken a role in discussions in society about new technologies. As I said, in Japan, the concept of Society 5.0 has become quite influential. With a slightly different organization in the historical periods, and also quite a deterministic picture, but for the sake of the argument, let's follow it. You can say technologies have typically been at the brink of a new stage in the development of our society. After the hunter-gatherers, we moved into an agrarian society because of a technology that enabled us to re-fertilize the soil. The plow did that for us. Because of the plow, we didn't need to move around all the time anymore, but we could stay on one place, which was the beginning, of course, of the emergence of cities, etc. Then the steam engine was the beginning of the industrial society. Of course, the industrial revolutions started out with the steam engine. And then the computer came into being, resulting in the information society, and now the fourth revolution, resulting in the digital society. And that's basically the background for the question of this talk. What can the cyborg be in this digital society? What is this hybridity of humans and technologies in this digital world? Maybe it's important to see that old idea that it's only about corporality, about a physical merger of humans and technologies, has become too narrow to understand what a cyborg is and how we are the new cyborgs that we have always been somehow. There's not only cyborg corporality, but there's also cyborg environmentality. Cyborgs are also, well, shaped by the environment in which they live. In a technological environment, you develop in new ways. And if we even see the whole theory about evolution, our cognitive evolution, our physical evolution, humans develop in interaction with their material environment, and the material environment is changing. There's also something like cyborg relationality, the way in which we have relations with each other, also how we deal with technologies, how we deal with the world mediated through augmented reality, for instance. How we interact with the world around us has changed because technologies, well, shape this whole relationality in new ways. And then ultimately leading, for instance, through artificial intelligence to cyborg mentality. The mind is changing. How we think, how we understand the world, how we interpret the world around us is taking shape through technologies. This has in fact always been the case. Writing has changed the functioning of our memory. The printing press has been at the brink of the scientific revolution. And now AI is changing how we understand the world, how we make decisions, how we do science even in yet another way. So this new cyborg is, well, a variation on a theme that we've seen before, but still a radically new one. Now, what does that notion of the new cyborg imply in Society 5.0? The first theme I would like to address is how inclusive the notion of the cyborg can be. And to toy again with the idea of the hand, are all hands on deck here? Whose hands are in fact on deck? Which human is part of human technology relations? Which organism is part of the cybernetic organism that the cyborg is? Or to say it differently, of which human are we post, if we speak about post-humanism? Whose hands matter? Typically, the idea has been that, well, the future is in our hands, right? So we shape a future with our technologies, and this is for humankind. If we also look at a lot of ethical discussions at the moment, people speak about AI for humanity. Humankind is, as it were, well, what is represented in the notion of the cyborg. But is it? Typically, there's quite a neoliberal idea behind all the fantasies of human enhancement, for instance, where it's actually most often about living longer, being stronger, being more happy, and being the engineer of your own life. It's about winners and losers, as it were. It's the whole world becomes a competition in which you need to be stronger in order to be able to win. It's quite a specific idea of what it means to be human. Even the very idea of human enhancement already implies that you have some kind of a normative framework saying, okay, this is a human and that's a better human. So you pretend to have a kind of criterion through which you can understand which humans would be better and which would actually not be better. But of course, there's a lot of humans not being represented in this idea of human technology relations. Cyborgs have been there always and have also always helped us to understand what it means to be human, because some people actually need technologies to be able to live their lives in the environment that we have made out of our own world. And that shows that maybe the notion of the cyborg is not only a helpful notion to free us from the idea that we have this core essence and that defines what it means to be human. Donna Haraway's point about the cyborg being liberating, freeing ourselves from, well, the possibility to pinpoint people on their bodies. The cyborg is also showing us that we really need to pay more attention to the human as an element of human technology relations. It's not only about how technologies mediate us, how technologies mediate our lives, it's also about how we make sense of technologies and which humans are an element of these cyborg relations. What is the human in the cyborg? What is the orc in the cyborg, you could say? Another element, obviously, is interculturality, multiculturality. Which human being is the model of the human in the cyborg? And moving back to the idea of neoliberal fantasies, typically it is quite a white idea of what it means to be human. Also, the ethical frameworks are quite monocultural, you could say. The neoliberal framework is still quite dominant in many ideas that people have about technology, typically maybe because people often see technology as ways to manipulate, to exert control, rather than something that is somehow relational, where there's also room for solidarity, for community, for vulnerability, etc. So which cultural framework is behind the human in the human-technology relations? Which cultural framework helps to shape what a cyborg is? It's all the more important because technologies have an impact all over the globe, which means that basically we would also need to reach some kind of a stage in which we can at least have a good ethical debate through and with various ethical frameworks from all over the world. How to organize that? We can only organize that if we see that all hands need to be on deck. It's also important on a more theoretical level that we see that whole idea of mediation as something dynamic, where there's always human-technology world relations in which humans also play this active appropriating role in making sense of the technologies that they use before the technologies can help us to make sense of the world around us. With an example that I've used more often, ultrasound, which helps you to make sense of the fetus. Ultrasound, of course, is a very interesting technology to make a first picture of your unborn child, of the fetus, and typically it ends up as the first picture in the baby album. And so then you appropriate the technology as a way to get in touch with the unborn, with the fetus. And that reveals the fetus not only as a very small human being in development, but then also as a potential patient, because you get information that also tells you something about the health condition of the fetus, which suddenly becomes a new context for the technology to be reinterpreted actually as an instrument that could play a role in abortion practices, where people suddenly now are burdened with the question, do you want to continue this whole pregnancy? Because actually it's not just fate anymore if you will get a child with some serious health condition. It has become a matter of choice, reconfiguring the human being then as someone who has to make decisions about the life of her or his child. So the human element in human-technology relations is super important, and is maybe something that has been underdeveloped or at least underemphasized in a lot of philosophy of technology of the past period. Human-technology world interactions do not only involve a mediating role of technologies between humans and world, but also an active appropriating role of the humans before technologies can start to play that mediating role in the first place. So, which human is the human in the cyborg relation? That was the second line. And then let's move to the third line. What could this imply for governance, for ethics of artificial intelligence? What could it imply if we take the future in our own hands? We have discovered that actually after the first hand, we developed a second hand. We have discovered that all hands need to be on deck. So which future can be in these hands? And how can we take the future somehow in these cyborg hands? Here, I think it's important to expand the ideas about ethics of technology. Expand it from some kind of a struggle, some kind of a fight between humans and technologies that is still typically the framework that many people have when they think about ethics. Ethics should somehow be some kind of a protection against technologies. Well, of course, from the notion that we have always been cyborgs, this is not a very meaningful framework to do ethics. What is meaningful is somehow to recognize that technology is somehow affecting us and is starting to look ever more like us and is actually giving a new shape to what it means to be human, because we are in continuous development towards being new type of cyborg. So that type of ethics should not be modeled after what people often see as the bioethics model, the medical ethical model, where often in medical ethics, the idea is there is a question, you ask it to a committee, and the committee says yes or no. You are allowed to do it or you are not allowed to do it. That model of ethics simply does not fit how to deal with new technologies, definitely not if we recognize that also we, as decision makers, are partly shaped by the technologies that we have to evaluate. And that's maybe the most important lesson to be drawn from that whole landscape model that I just explained to you, based on the work of a former PhD student of mine, by the way, Olia Kudina, who's now working at Delft University of Technology as an assistant professor. In that landscape model, you can also quite interestingly see that also the ethical frameworks from which human beings evaluate technologies are partly shaped by these technologies themselves. There's something like value dynamism. Values are not stable, will not always remain the same. They develop over time. And it also means that when we try to govern technologies, we need to anticipate what values might mean in the future. And there are famous examples of this, like anesthesia. In the first days of anesthesia, it was highly contested to give people anesthesia during surgery because it was seen as suppressing a very important signal of the body, a signal that was part of the integrity of the body. You don't just cancel that and then you operate on somebody without somebody even being conscious of it. And of course, by now, the opposite has become true. It would be totally immoral to operate on somebody without anesthesia. And so the meaning of the value of dignified suffering, human dignity, has developed over time in interaction with technology. Meaning that raising ethical questions about technologies is super complicated because it does not only require us to anticipate potential future implications of technologies on society, but also to anticipate the ethical frameworks with which they might be evaluated in the future. If you see the current discussion in the world about artificial intelligence, the discussion is typically framed as some kind of a struggle between frameworks. About artificial intelligence, the struggle is typically framed as a struggle between the East and the West, and then the European Union is somewhere in between. So either we choose for Western values, American values, where basically all your data are owned by big companies that make a lot of money with your data and try to seduce you into more consumption. The alternative is the Eastern model, the Chinese model, typically, where your data are owned by the state and the state tries to steer your behavior towards the desirable behavior, that how the state wants you to behave. And then the European Union, hopes to open a third way. Just like we used to have the third way between capitalism and communism, the third way is human-centered artificial intelligence, human-centered AI. Meaning that human values should be at the core of the design and the use of artificial intelligence. Interesting, you could say, because it's a deliberate and I think a very welcome attempt to connect ethics and technology, and not to locate ethics in the realm of the humans and technology in the realm of the objects, and then only see ethics as a way to keep technology in or out. But still, in this whole story, it's only about the Northern Hemisphere. Many countries, many cultural frameworks, many approaches are not even on this list. From the perspective of UNESCO, for instance, where I'm also quite active in an ethics commission of science and technology, in UNESCO, the whole idea is that we try to organize ethical discussions with people from all over the globe, where ethics is not just about trying to find this one unified answer, but basically it's about organizing a discussion, organizing a debate, where we try to combine the various ethical frameworks that exist all over the globe. Where typically one of the main dimensions in the debate is about how to combine individually oriented ethical frameworks, typically the Western frameworks, focusing on autonomy, privacy, etc., with more, you could call it something like more collectivity-based approaches, focusing on care, on solidarity, which are typically predominant in non-Western culture. Even the word non-Western already gives some kind of a central focus to the idea that, Western ethics should be the point of orientation. Doing this means that we should also really try to think about artificial intelligence and about digital technologies, about the cyborgs that we are making of ourselves from a very broad intercultural point of view. But the key idea from UNESCO's point of view is obviously that what we are doing is changing the way in which we think. In the organization of UNESCO, it's all about the mind. It's about education, science, culture, and about communication. It's about how the mind functions. And that's exactly where artificial intelligence is working on the mind, on how we think, how we interpret the world, how we understand the world, how we make decisions. So that means that it's also about interculturality. The algorithms on Netflix and Spotify help to shape our tastes for culture. Can we have a Spotify algorithm that also helps us to develop a taste for musical styles from beyond our own little bubble of taste we have developed over the past time, for instance. Small languages, what will happen to small languages in an age of machine translation? Can they survive somehow? Do we have a responsibility actually to design artificial intelligence in such a way that they can, in order to somehow be able to keep them alive? In many ways, digital technologies affect the mind, affect how we think. And we need to find a global perspective to take that into account. It also means that we should not start from one single set of values. Maybe we should even give up the idea of this top-down ethics where we formulate a set of, values or a set of basic guidelines or criteria that should be followed by anyone in the field of a technology. In order to reverse the perspective, we have developed over the past years an approach for the ethics of technology, which we have called guidance ethics. And guidance ethics tries to be an alternative for assessment ethics. Ethics is not only about assessing a technology, but also about guiding technology in a responsible way. And the aim of this whole approach is actually to do an ethics from within. Not an ethics from outside that stands outside the technology with a set of values or a set of principles and that tries to apply them to a technology, saying yes or no to the new societal development, the new technology. Basically an ethics from within, trying to stand next to the developments, trying to understand how they will affect society and what kind of ethical questions emerge from that and how we can deal with them. So that's one thing, ethics from within. The second one is typically focusing on something that you could call maybe something like, you could call positive ethics. Positive ethics meaning not that every technology is good, that we should be positive about every new technology. Positive ethics meaning that we should not do negative ethics in terms of trying to identify what we do not want, but we should rather try to identify the conditions for what we do want. Values. What are the central values regarding a technology? How can we identify them and how can we connect them to the development of a technology and its social implementation? And third, you can also say this is bottom-up ethics and not a top-down ethics. It's an ethics that doesn't start from the principles that are typically formulated by experts or by people in power. It starts actually from the practices around a technology. Citizens, professionals working with a technology, they have a very close understanding of the implications of a technology, and that's where the discussion should take place. And in this way, we also hope to shape a basis for this intercultural dialogue. Because you do not start from a cultural framework, but you start from technologies in a context where there are implications. And by opening a discussion about that, all frameworks can play a role, typically. So in the approach for any technology, you can take 3 steps. You start out by describing the case. What is the technology in its context? How does it work? What role does it play in a practice of, healthcare, of something like public administration? It could be a robot in a hospital. It could be a drone for crowd control in a city. How does the technology work and how do people experience it? And then maybe the most important step is the second step, the dialogue step, where you first try to identify the actors. So who are engaged, who are involved in the functioning, who experience the implications of the new kind of technology. Then it's about the effects. So what are the implications? How does this technology have an effect? And how does a feeding robot influence the interaction between the doctor and the patient, the doctor and the nurse, the patient and her or his own body, the patient and people who also live maybe in the place where she or he is living. And then finally, which values are at stake through these effects. That's what it's ultimately about. Identifying these values is what this second stage in the guidance ethics approach wants to do. Because as soon as we have the values, we can do something positive with them. So the values are not intended to function as some kind of an assessment tool saying yes or no, but they are the beginning of the third stage, which is about options for action. And so the values could either be embedded in the technology, in a redesign of the technology, or in the environment, regulation. Maybe we need other technologies to support the functioning of this very specific technology to keep up all the values, or the user. maybe we could equip the user with communication, education, information, empowering users to deal with technologies in a critical way, also to keep up the values that we have derived at the end of stage 2. So this guidance ethics approach is a handy tool, so to speak, and to come back to the idea of the hands. Hands as very important elements of how to think of the cyborg. Hands as a crucial means also to think about what it means to live in a digital world. And to conclude my talk and also to stay in the sphere of UNESCO, I would like to show you this painting, a very interesting painting at one of the walls of the UNESCO building. Actually, I always walk along this painting when I go to the meeting rooms in the UNESCO building in the time that we could still do this before we had the virus. Icarus falling, drawn by Picasso, where the myth of Icarus maybe also very nicely shows what is at stake in these hands, where actually the hands become wings. Yeah, because in that story, it's all about how to deal in a responsible way with technologies. In fact, the whole story is about Icarus being with his father, Daedalus, locked up on an island, the island of Crete. And of course, they cannot go back to Athens, and they really want to go back. And then Daedalus, the designer, the engineer of the stories of that time, invents a trick. He says, okay, let's just make wings so that we can fly. And so they collect wood and feathers and wax, and they build wings as these, well, new hands that they have in order to fly back. And then just before they fly back, Daedalus gives this advice to his son, which is all about responsible ethics and about guidance ethics. He says, if you fly too low, then you will absorb the water, and your wings will absorb the water of the sea, and you will fall. So don't fly too low. If you fly too high, you will be too close to the sun. The wax will melt, your wings will disintegrate. So don't fly too high. Find the right middle. And of course, you also need to keep flying, because if not, you will fall anyway. Well, we all know how the story ended. Maybe Icarus flew too high, the wings disintegrated, and he fell. It's an interesting story, because not only because it's about a kind of hands, it also helps us to move beyond the notion of the hands, or try to think what the notion of the hands means for us as human beings in the first place, but specifically because it's about ethics. Ethics of technology is not being about saying yes or no, but about answering the question of how. And who answers the question is very important. All hands need to be on deck. And that deck, of course, is a technical deck. And the hands can be cyborg hands. But the human in the cyborg is a very central notion that needs to get much more attention in our thinking of the cyborg. And then, of course, taking the future in our hands means that also all hands should be on deck in ethics, where the guidance ethics approach can be a way to find that right middle and to make sure that indeed all people can join the ethical discussion. Thank you very much.
Welcome back after this beautiful and inspiring presentation. Welcome, Peter-Paul. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we received quite some questions, so you intrigued quite some people from home. A lot of questions also really having to do with our sense of how this all technology influences ourselves. So let's start with the first question, which is from Linda Bijs. And she asked, with the fast technological developments and this merging of man and machine, do you think we also, let's say, lose something? Linda asked, do we even get more, let's say, stupid with the fastness with which these technological developments happen?
Wow. Super good question, I think. Yeah, well, maybe there is a risk, of course, that we lose things if we don't manage to redesign ourselves as well in accordance with the technologies that we are designing. So there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence being accompanied by artificial stupidity of the humans dealing with it. And I think there is a point in that, in the sense that if we do not develop the capacity to understand how artificial intelligence is affecting us, how it's informing our decisions, how AI is fed with data sets that might be biased, etc. But if we don't understand that, then of course we will rely on a system that makes us rather stupid than smart. But I think ethics is then more about trying to identify these things, that these are values that are at stake, and that we also need to reinvent ourselves and redesign what it means to be human, as it were, in interaction with the technologies that we are designing. So, in that sense, the possibility that we lose things is more of a wake up call to me, because that should not be the idea. Which, by the way, also doesn't mean that I think there is something like moral progress, that we're always getting better, that we are basically in the process of human enhancement. I don't think that either. I think we're in a continuous flux where technologies reconfigure what it means to be human, reconfigure what human freedom, human autonomy is, what solidarity means, what vulnerability means, what a society is, and that we continuously need to, well, keep in tune with the technologies that we are designing in order to realize this just and good society.
Thank you very much. I think especially this aspect of continuously changing, this flux, this also changing aspects of vulnerability, of human emotions. I think that is something that that touches very much the next question. Which is from Brian. He's a filmmaker and currently working on a film about a trans woman who wants to become a cyborg to overcome especially human vulnerabilities. And in Brian's film, as he explains in his question, the self is never fixed. It is much more fluid, and you can have multiple versions of yourself that could even coexist. So here we see already like a very different future image of our relationship with technology. Could you elaborate a little bit on this point, or about these possibilities of fluidity and coexistence?
Super interesting. Really very important point. I think this is really the point with which a lot of thinking of many people started about the cyborg. This is, I think, Donna Haraway's point about the cyborg in her Cyborg Manifesto, where she beautifully showed that the cyborg can also be seen as a celebration of not being fixed to your body, to your essence that is given to you by the context in which you live. So the cyborg for Donna Haraway is a figure that does not have an origin that is beyond itself. You are your own origin in a sense, of course, in a context, but you cannot be pinpointed to your gender, to your sex, to your body, to whatever. So in that sense, I think the notion of the cyborg has been very helpful for many people who actually try to see the cyborg also as a way to think in a more inclusive way about what it means to be human. So people speak about the cribborg also. And why should the cyborg always have this notion of the superhuman, the Superman, of course, typically in the neoliberal discourse, successfulness, being a winner. That's maybe not the only way to think about what a cyborg can be. And so the whole idea of a cribborg, people who are dependent on technologies to live their lives in the first place because they do not meet the norm of most other human beings in our society. That's maybe a better way to understand what a cyborg is. Because in a sense, we have always been cyborgs, and we are all cyborgs. We cannot live without technologies. We need technologies to survive in this world. Also, the able human beings. So in that sense, I think this is a beautiful question, which shows that the cyborg should not be seen as a celebration of our power, of us being godlike or something. It's more a celebration of our vulnerability, our dependence, our smallness, our need to live in a world with technology, where technology is more our fate than our choice, I would say.
Very well said. We have another
Shall I take
another
yes?
question. Yes.
So in your first answer just now, you mentioned words like value and biases, and actually one of the questions that we got sent kind of touches on this, which is from Madi Nasser. Madi Nasser asks, like, which human value should we, or maybe the algorithm, value more? So are there more important values than others, or in which way can we foster more inclusivity through technology, or maybe inequality, I would say, maybe.
Yeah, nice. The interesting thing of the question is that there are already values in the question. So inclusiveness, inequality, equality. I think that's that seems to be the background of the question, and that's maybe also a route towards an answer. I mean, it's really hard, I think, to give this encompassing answer to which values should be in any new technology. It's almost like how do you say? Something like a totalitarian act that you think, okay, I am going to design the technology with the values that should apply for everyone always. That's not how we should see ethics. I think ethics is also something that's in a continuous deliberation. That's also, I think, what I tried to say a little bit in the discussion about, the East and the West and the EU, which seems to be a question about, well, who has the true morality. Should the market be in charge, or should the state be in charge, or should we have human rights or democracy in charge? Who is the winner? But if you frame it like that, then you do not really lay a basis for a global dialogue. And that's really what I've learned so much from my work at UNESCO. Maybe the biggest lesson I've ever learned in my life so far, and I'm only halfway, I hope, just hit 50. And so to have a place where you just meet with people from all over the globe with the only purpose to exchange your moral ideas and to reach a way of dealing with the diversity, which doesn't mean that you reach some kind of a unifying framework in which all views should fit. It's more that you reach a way of dealing with diversity from indeed the basic intuition that we need to respect this diversity. So that's coming back to the question. In the question, there was already one central value implied, and that was inclusiveness and respect for diversity. And I think that's maybe the hardest thing to do in ethics. It's finding a balance in the paradox that there seems to be between universalism on the one hand and relativism on the other hand. So universalism is one unified framework that applies to anyone, and relativism, there are many frameworks and we can't decide which one is the real one. Neither of the two works. So we should actually learn to live with this duality and to keep finding ways to deal with it. And that's why ethics is an activity. It's not something that's set in stone. This is not law. It's not a book that you can read and then you can apply it to a situation. Ethics is something that we have to do, to keep doing. And that's also why the guidance ethics approach for me has become so important, because that's actually nothing more than a tool to keep asking ethical questions bottom up in a positive way with people from all over the globe.
And maybe following through on this, how do you see then? One of the things that came up a lot during interviews for the Cyborg Futures project was the influence of like the big corporations, because, well, they obviously, they do have some values that they would like to see for the world, and they're the ones mostly designing these technologies. So how would you handle that from an ethics standpoint?
This is one of the biggest challenges, especially in our digital times, right? So, you can have many ambitions to have this approach that you have all cultures around the table and you try to find a way to deal with diversity. But if we have become dependent on companies for an infrastructure that we cannot live without, the digital world has become a primary good, as we call that in ethics, right? It's a condition without which you cannot live. If that condition is in the hands of companies with as a purpose to make money, rather than in the hands of a community with as a purpose to let the community flourish, then we have a very big problem. So in that sense, I can indeed sympathize with some of the ideas behind that third way of the European Union, where the whole idea is that, especially in the digital world, the EU has been quite harsh on big tech companies, with huge fines, with the GDPR, the data protection regulation, uh, and forcing that some central values, in this case regarding privacy, are being respected by these companies. And if not, they get huge fines, or they cannot do their work anymore. I think these forms of regulation are very important, and it would be very, very important that we have such regulations for the entire world. Well, of course, that is very hard. We don't have a world governance, we hardly have a European government. But still, there are attempts. So, for instance, within UNESCO, the past year we've been working on a recommendation on the ethics of AI. So, a recommendation is some kind of a normative instrument, and if all the member states sign that recommendation, then they actually, well, say that they will report every 2 or 4 years on how they have actually succeeded in implementing that framework. So such things are super important, I think, for the world. Not because I'm against companies. I think that would be odd. But I am against the power that the companies have taken with private interest over the public sphere that we all need to live a decent life.
Yes, this is a very, very interesting topic. And during your presentation, you were also mentioning some examples of a positive use of technology. For instance, with algorithms that can broaden your music taste on Spotify or Netflix. This is naturally, of course, all corporations. The question is, who is responsible for having this potential positive technology implemented? Because the examples you mentioned about privacy, it's mostly law that forbid or contain something. Should we also have a more positive or more initiative? What kind of steps can we take, let's say, and who should take them? Who has the responsibility to also, let's say, maybe promote a more positive use of technology? Yes.
We're back. Yeah, sorry, I somehow lost the connection.
There he is
We were
again.
trying to fill the time.
Oh, sorry. I have no idea what happened. Suddenly you were gone, and I tried to reconnect, but now I'm back. Sorry. Did you hear my answer, or did you completely miss the answer that I gave?
Well, I was just asking a question. I don't know if you answered it already. We were actually who should take the responsibility to have this kind of regulation implemented, but not only regulation in the sense of forbidding or containing or like privacy laws, but also more propositive, like this is how we should or could use technology, and who are the players there who can do something?
Yeah, super. Yeah, so I did not hear that question. I was referring to the earlier question about the importance of having rules for big tech. Yeah, I think this is also a very important question, and we need more places for this. And I think the best place to have this discussion is the UN. I mean, there is basically no other place where the world can come together to raise these questions. But this is also a super complicated, issue, because within the UN, it's hard to reach an agreement, of course. And I think maybe the main focus should also not be on having some kind of a worldwide legislation, but maybe to have places where the entire world comes together to discover common frameworks. And just like there is this IPCC working on climate change, and we are now working actually with a team of people on the ethics of emerging technologies. Why not make a council of people who can feed the debates within the world, within governments all over the world, within societies, to discuss how new technologies are changing our society and which ethical frameworks could apply. I believe actually in the importance of that. I think the most important issue we have is that many parliaments simply do not even have a language to speak about these things. It's yeah, and that requires a lot, because it requires that you are able to read technologies as something social, that you are able to cross the boundary between technology and society, between the field of the sciences and the field of the social sciences and the humanities. I think that's an ability that people don't have by nature. So we need places, institutions that provide a language, frameworks, orientation to deal with issues like that, I think.
Very, very important topics and themes, and it makes me think of a project that we are just starting up at IMPAKT. It's called Code NLD. It's together with the School of Machine in Berlin, where we're exploring exactly this question and how to talk and with policymakers, how yeah, I don't want to say educate, but how do you develop this language? How do you speak with each other? How do you understand? And how do you also include citizens eventually that are the people that profit from this? So what do you think? What could be a first step? What can we also take? This project consists also of workshops, expert meeting, symposium.
Yeah.
What should we tell them, do you think?
I think,
what could be a
well,
first step?
the most important thing in what you said, I think, is including the citizens. I think that's something that we have really lost almost in our democracy. So we have reached a point in which every issue needs to be solved by experts. And of course, experts are important. I would never say that we don't need ethicists or philosophers of technology anymore, not because I'm one of them, but I think we have an expertise that can contribute to society. But it doesn't mean that we have a monopoly. So if we do not empower society to deal by itself with these questions, then we actually create a dependency on expertise that is not healthy. So that would also imply that people feel maybe alienated from these, this elite of experts that has all kinds of opinions and views on society, and they don't feel heard. Maybe just to give a very concrete example from my own context here within the Netherlands, where I've been quite engaged with the ethics around the Corona app that we have, the contact tracing app regarding the COVID-19 virus. So an app that can detect through the Bluetooth radio and mobile phones if you've been closer than 1.5 meters to somebody else within for a longer time than 15 minutes. And if so, and the other person appears to be infected with the virus, you can get a notification. Very contested thing. And so, of course, we have been trying to implement a lot of issues regarding people's privacy and regarding people's autonomy in this app. There was a big discussion also about the relation between the state and the citizens. Super important. But when we asked citizens about this, we had a separate ethical session with the citizens. A completely different picture came to the foreground, which was totally overlooked by the experts, which was a whole framework of solidarity, that people felt the need to contribute to a better society by sharing their data. They wanted to have the ability to share their location, to help the local health authorities to find where there are new places where the virus is very active. They wanted to share their contact list. So the experts were quite far away from the citizens. And I think that is a situation that's very undesirable if it comes to new technologies that have such a profound influence on our society. So citizen empowerment from ethics is super important. And again, that's also why I believe so much in this guidance ethics approach, because that's basically a very simple, basic tool to empower citizens to engage actively in ethics, not as a fight between the government and themselves, but to sit on the driver's seat, to look from the perspective of the entire society and all the implications that a technology can have.
Yeah, and this is also, I think, a task for experts and governments and also UNESCO, the UN, to actually open or be maybe also more make it easier for citizens to speak up, to show, because sometimes it feels like very far away or not. It's not like you send an email or you call the UN to tell your vision or what is not working. So there is also some things need to be put in place there, I think, to bridge this gap.
We are now in the Dutch AI coalition toying with the idea to ask the libraries in the Netherlands to host ethics sessions about AI with citizens. And to use an approach like the guidance ethics approach or another approach, but in any case, an approach that's very accessible. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to have read your ethical theory or something. You can just join such a session and together think about the implications of artificial intelligence for society in specific, very concrete realms within our society. And then, well, in order to be able to make a collection of the concerns that people have, to let those concerns be the basis of ethical frameworks that we could develop and that we could also somehow contrast maybe with the ideas that the experts have.
Yeah.
Maybe
Time flies, and I think we have time for one more question. We received much more, but
yeah,
let's
maybe
do one last we can do.
Yes. So we got a question from Eliana Bergamin, who wants to discuss the role of social media and your mediation theory. So she says that you talked about how we're from a certain perspective we've always been cyborgs, and she asked, especially considering humans and socialization and the addictive and big role social media play in our lives nowadays, and I think also implied in this question is the influence of social media in like the general discourse and ideology of people. So what could be the role of this technological mediation, and what could it, maybe together with ethics, help solve the issues that these platforms have?
Very important question. Super important question. Yeah, of course, social media have become so influential and so deeply intertwined with, basically every aspect of our lives. At the individual level, our identity formation; at the social level, how we have friendships, love relations, how we deal with our neighbors; and also at the societal level, at the more political level, how we orient ourselves in politics, how we form our IDs, how we vote, etc. I think the approach of technological mediation can help to understand how these technologies are doing that. So, on the one hand, that means that you can look for a continuity with the past, where you can say, well, it's basically also a continuation of earlier new technologies, where the TV had a lot of impact also. I mean, there are these very interesting writings about the role of the TV in the Gulf War and how it basically was a TV war where the manipulation of images also helped us understand what the war was. The Second World War, according to Marshall McLuhan, was the radio war, where radio messages helped to shape how people understood this. Media have always shaped our understanding of the world. And the initial reaction to mass media was, of course, that it was a culture industry and it was alienating, and there was this kind of authenticity that was somehow destroyed by the media. But the better you look, you think, no, this has always been the case. And what we need to learn is to deal with these media, to understand how they shape us in order to also take responsibility for ourselves being shaped by them. And I think this is what we are also learning. If I look at how my children are dealing with social media and how I am doing that, it's totally different. How easily they integrate it, how easily they also make a distinction between people's profiles on social media and in real life, how much more easily they can also deal with the bombardment of notifications that they can ignore much more easily than I can. And so somehow we need to learn to appropriate these new technologies. I think the main challenge is that the appropriation speed that is required from us is so high now. The developments go really, really fast, and especially the advent of artificial intelligence, which also helps the social media to shape what we see and how we therefore understand the world in a tailor-made way. That's a very big challenge. So the answer for me would not be then to say, okay, we need to have rules to say, hey, you shall not do this or you shall do that. The answer should more be, these three lines in the guidance ethics. How can we design the technologies in a responsible way with a view on how technologies mediate at this individual, social, and political level? But also, how can we organize the environment? So how can we have good laws, rules, regulations in order to make sure that things don't run out of hand? And also, how can we empower the individual user to be somehow critical, to understand what these media are doing, and to be able to appropriate them in a responsible and in some kind of critical way? If you think like that, then the media becomes a challenge. It's not your enemy that we need to fight. There's no point in fighting it. This is a new condition for humankind. We cannot think them away. So the only responsible answer for me would be to look at someone straight into the eyes and to reinvent ourselves, our society, politics in interaction with what these new media can do.
And possibly in an inclusive way, as a title of the lecture, inclusive ethics.
Exactly.
Exactly. I think we try to answer as many questions. Still, it's just the tip of an iceberg, and there is so much more to talk about. This is why we can also have some after talk at the Zoom bar afterwards. We invite you all. The link will be shared in a second. Meanwhile, please also have a look at our web project at cyborg@impact.nl. From tomorrow onwards, you can also watch again Peter-Paul Verbeek lecture if you want to refresh some of the information. And so thank you very much. Thank you, Peter-Paul Verbeek, for the beautiful lecture and all these insightful answers.
It was a pleasure. Very nice.
Are you joining us in the Zoom bar, Peter-Paul?
Yes, I will. I will take a beer and I will join you.
So if your answer if your question wasn't asked, or you're still looking for more answers about guidance, ethics, mediation theory, or all kinds of other fun stuff, please join us in the Zoom bar where Peter-Paul Verbeek will be ready to answer all your questions with his beer. Yeah,
See you there.
The link is also in the YouTube comments. Our online moderator will put it there. And well, see you there in the Zoom bar.
And thanks again for watching.
Yes, thanks for watching.
Bye.